Welcome to this episode of the Christopher Hall Training Podcast, where we're going to be putting low back pain and movement into perspective. We're going to look at, should you move your spine? When is a good time to move your spine? When is a bad time to move your spine? It's quite an emotive topic. There are a lot of professionals out there, and let's just say social media influencers that aren't professionals out there, suggesting that we should move the spine, we should be loading the spine, we should be going to end ranges of the spine. So what we're going to do in this tutorial, we're going to try and put that into perspective so we can understand low back pain a little bit more, but also its rehabilitation as well. If you are struggling with lower back pain and you do want some help, please do hit the link in the description and you'll go through to my How to Overcome Lower Back Pain consultation and coaching. This can be done online or face-to-face. So if you are struggling with lower back pain, please click that and get yourself involved, and we can get you a plan, start building a plan to get you out of your lower back pain. I want to start this episode sort of setting it up, laying the land, and understanding the perspective in which this is coming from. Now, when most, let's just say people, which includes professionals and non-professionals, when they are talking about lower back pain, they will generally speak about lower back pain as one topic. So they will say, you have lower back pain, this is what you need to do. You have lower back pain, if someone is saying this, this is wrong. Now, what we have to understand first is what are the different types of lower back pain? Because if we start understanding that there are different types of lower back pain, what we can then start to understand is that there are different triggers. And if there are different triggers, there are different rehabilitation methods or processes. So what should be happening is, if you have this type of lower back pain, this is going to be a more effective approach. If you have this type of lower back pain, this will be a more effective approach. Now, again, it's not even as simple as that. There are more nuances to those. But if we just come from, you have this thing called lower back pain, you need to strengthen your lower back pain, or you need to strengthen your lower back, or you need to take your lower back through end ranges of movement and then strengthen those end ranges of movement. That's too simplistic a model, because there is not a lower back pain. There are lots of different types of lower back pain. So if we can come from that understanding, we can start to build a better model for rehabilitation. So we can't just throw everyone into the same bucket and say, right, strengthen your lower back through the end ranges and your lower back will be healed, because that's just not the case. So as an example, what types of lower back pain are there? Well, there is a stenosis, which is a narrowing of the canal. There is a spondylolisthesis, which is where a vertebra slips. There is a disc herniation, where the disc bulge, the fluid within the disc comes out. There is a disc bulge, which is a slightly, let's just say, lesser injury than a disc herniation, because the fluid is only bulging and it hasn't fully herniated out. There is sciatica, where the pain goes down the leg, which can come from a disc herniation. So there are lots of different types of lower back pain, and all these different types will have certain markers and symptoms and triggers to them. Some of the lower back pain, you could have the same type of lower back pain, but the triggers are different. So as an example, some people may have flexion intolerant spines and they can't manage sitting. Some people can manage sitting, but they can't manage standing. Some people can manage walking and some people can't manage walking. So again, we've got this puzzle that we're trying to work out. So we might have a type of lower back pain that we understand because it's shown up on an MRI scan. There's a report, you can see it on the image. The disc has bulged at L4, L5, and you know you've got a disc bulge there because you can see it on the MRI scan or on the sort of report that gets written, and it's like, right, okay, I've got a disc herniation. What now? Well, these people could have different triggers. Like I said, someone can tolerate sitting. Someone might not be able to tolerate sitting with a disc herniation. Someone may be able to tolerate standing. Some people might not. Some people may be able to tolerate certain exercises. Some people may not. So not only have we got the diagnosis of a disc bulge or a disc herniation or a stenosis or a spondylolisthesis or a sciatica or whatever it may be, not only have we got that diagnosis, but we've then got the different movement habits of the people and the different tolerance of those movement habits and the different triggers that come out. So we've got these different layers. So there's sort of understandings that we can get. Okay, we've got a disc herniation. Well, a disc herniation, and we'll talk about this in a little bit more depth, is generally caused by flexion extension cycles depending on where the herniation comes out of the disc. So it's not going to be advantageous to go into flexion and extension cycles. So we need to try and maintain a proper posture of the spine. So that's sort of like the first layer. Then we've got the movement habit layer, the sitting, the standing, the walking, the different types of exercise. We need to be able to navigate our way through that. So not only do we know the general principle of how we can make a disc herniation or disc bulge worse, we've then got to understand all the different movement habits that come with it and see if they line up with that. So we've got to understand that. So I guess to finish off this sort of section, we can't, just to summarise what we've talked about, we can't just lump everyone into you've got lower back pain. What we've got to be able to do is be able to divide them up into what type of lower back pain have you got. What we can then do is understand from a general perspective the mechanisms of those types of injuries and the different movement triggers that people have got. Because over here we've got one, and over here we've got the injury mechanism. Over here we've got the movement habits, and we've got to try and put those together so it sort of becomes one rehabilitation process, and that's going to be different for everyone depending on the injury and the movement habits. So again, that's like a little algorithm or a little puzzle that we need to work out. So hopefully that gives you a better understanding of the lay of the land. So what types of lower back pain are there? What type of lower back pain have you got? Or what type of lower back pain has a patient or a client got? So you can then start to investigate not only the diagnosis of it, but also their movement habits as well. Now let's talk about how does the low back become injured? So we've talked about various different injuries. We've talked about, or conditions, or disorders, or whatever you want to call them. So we've talked about sciatica, we've talked about disc bulges and herniations, we've talked about stenosis, we've talked about spondylolisthesis, or we haven't talked about them, we've mentioned them. And so, how do these injuries occur? Well, there can be genetic factors, so they will be in the mix as well. So we've got to have an understanding of those. They could be from one traumatic injury. So one event, you were in a car accident. Obviously, that's one traumatic. You had a fall from a height, let's say, and that's cracked the pars interparticularis, and that's created the crack in the vertebra, and that's how it slipped. You've landed from a fall that's created the disc bulge, whatever it may be. But as a general rule, those are very few and far between. So what we tend to find is that injuries are a build-up. So injuries or low back injuries, well, not even low back injuries, you can look into other injuries as well. Shoulder impingement, Achilles tendon ruptures. They are generally a straw that broke the camel's back that are built up using moderate load, and you don't really notice the process happening. So a lot of people that do lift weights poorly with flexed spines, they could have a genetic factor that makes them less predisposed to back injuries. So there could be a part of their makeup and the reason why they think that lower back pain isn't a problem and you should move your spine. So that could be a part of it. There's also the build-up of poor movement, so lots of sitting, poor lifting mechanics, if you are bent over a lot, if you are sat down a lot. So all of these different movement habits can cause a problem. And what they do is when you start reading enough information around lower back pain, what you start seeing is you start seeing particular words. Things like micro trauma, micro injuries, stress fractures. So all these types of injuries are small injuries that you don't notice that are happening. Now, if you don't recover them properly or you don't allow them to recover properly, they will accumulate. And as they accumulate, they will eventually cause a problem. Now, the problem is generally manifested when you're doing something really innocuous, reaching across a table, going down to tie your shoelaces up, picking a pen up off the floor, and then you think it was that. I've even heard a sneeze can do it. And what a lot of people think, so the people that it's happened to and the professionals that are treating them, they think it was that one moment that caused the problem. Whereas it was a build-up of, let's just say, poor movement habits or small movement errors, whatever you want to call it. They build up, they haven't been recovered properly, and then eventually the back can't cope anymore, and that happens. The same is said in Achilles tendon ruptures, the same is also said in shoulder impingement as well. It's an accumulation of small movement errors, and they build up, and eventually it pops, and you've got yourself an injury, which was actually, it's more of a condition of your environment or your movement or whatever. So that, in a very broad sense, is how the back becomes injured. Now, if we dig down a little bit more, what you can start to find are the postures or the positions or the movements that cause that. So spine flexion will play its part. Spinal extension will play its part. Shear forces, so that could be a lateral shear force, it could be an anterior shear force, or it could be a posterior shear force. So you've got all these different shear forces pulling on the spine, which can then bring about an injury. You've got also the load as well, and that's important to talk about. We'll discuss it in a little bit more depth next. But when we add load into the mix, so if we have poor movement habits, and then we load those poor movement habits, then we're going to speed up the process, if you will. So it only the injury doesn't necessarily become worse, it just happens to you quicker. And as I mentioned, there are genetic predispositions, so some people will get it even quicker, and some people it won't happen as quickly too. So again, we have to take that into consideration as well. It doesn't mean that that someone who's got certain genetics will never get lower back pain. It just means it will happen, or it can happen later on. Some people may avoid it, some people may be lucky, this, that and the other. But if we don't know those genetics, then it's much more advantageous to stick to what we do know, and that is certain movements cause it a problem, and certain movements or certain postures and positions don't. So again, as a summary, how does the low back become injured? It becomes injured over time. with micro traumas and micro injuries and stress fractures that can build up over time that don't get recovered. There are genetic factors that can speed up that and slow that down. If we add load into the mix, it speeds up the process. And then we've got the movements like flexion, extension, anterior shears, posterior shears, lateral shears. So all those different things can contribute to causing a low back injury. It is very rarely one movement or one moment or one movement, if you will, that causes the problem. Should we strengthen the lower back against any of this? Well, I'm going to say no to that. We shouldn't strengthen it on a couple of levels. I mean, we do need to build the capacity of the lower back, but that includes strength, it includes endurance, and it includes stability of the spine. So again, it's a different approach than what most people will use. So strengthening the lower back and using range of movement for that is another thing I should say. So strengthening the low back with movement. Now, there is a time and a place for it, but for most people, it comes later. So, what does all that mean? Again, if we look at how the back becomes injured, and this is something I didn't mention, when we go to extreme ranges of movement, again, that's where the problem's sped up. If we use moderate movement, it's slowed down somewhat. But if we use extreme ranges of movement, it's sped up. Again, if we add load into that, it causes the problem. So, if you have lower back pain and you have triggers or a low back, if you have a flexion intolerant spine, which basically means your spine doesn't like flexion, it's probably not a good idea to put it into flexion and then load it. So by strengthening a lower back in that way, it's not going to be effective, because you understand that the trigger is flexion, you're then loading that flexion, and load with the flexion is only really making the problem worse. It's not necessarily making it better. So from that perspective, it's not a good idea to strengthen the lower back. If you have extension intolerance, so your spine doesn't like going into extension, the same can be said. So we have to understand the triggers. If we look at a disc herniation, how is a disc herniation caused? Full flexion and full extension of the spine. What that's basically doing is that's pushing the fluid in the spine backwards towards the outside of the spine until it bulges or until it herniates. So that causes that problem. So we start to see, well, if that's causing the problem, why am I doing that? So what we need to be able to do is we need to, first of all, be able to maintain a posture. So that's the first thing, which as a general sense is a neutral spine. And people don't like neutral spine. Okay, I'll use a more appropriate definition, which would be elastic equilibrium. So if you can imagine, you've got one vertebra sat on top of another, you've got two vertebrae, one sat on top of the other, and you've got, let's just say, elastic bands, one on the side, or one on the left, one on the right, one on the front, one on the back. If you flex it forward, obviously the back one becomes stretched and the front one goes slack. If you bend it to the left, the right one becomes stretched and the left one becomes slacked. Elastic equilibrium is where all those elastic bands are evenly tensioned around. That's what would be a neutral spine or an elastic equilibrium. Yes, there is a range to it. I understand that. And yes, it's very hard to maintain that 24/7. I understand that. But if you can hold it nearer a neutral spine or that elastic equilibrium, it's going to be more effective for you. Why? Because the load is distributed around the passive tissues of the spine more evenly. If you go into flexion or lateral flexion or rotation, they get concentrated. And that's what drives the micro injuries and the micro traumas and the stress fractures. So what we need to be able to do is distribute that load. So we would start from there. Then we would look at, well, there is nothing supporting the lumbar vertebra. So what we then need to do is we then need to activate the muscles around it. So we need to brace the abdominals. Now, we need to brace appropriately for the very simple reason, if we brace too hard, we may have a compression trigger to the spine. So it doesn't like lots of muscle activation around it. So we need to brace appropriately. And what we then need to be able to do is maintain that neutral spine through movement. So basically we hinge at the hip. So we've got neutral spine, brace the abdominals, hinge at the hip when it comes to movement, and also hinge at the shoulder when it comes to upper body movement. So again, we're not overly extending the spine when we take our arms up over our head. So we need to start thinking about it in that way when it comes to strengthening the lower back. First of all, we need to get the muscles active to stabilize. So just by bracing the abdominals, you will stabilize, just like the ropes on a sail will stabilize the sail. Just like guy wires on tent will stabilize the tent. When they are pulled taut, just like the muscles of your lumbar spine, they will hold those 5 vertebrae in place and stabilize it. Once you've got it stabilized, you can then start to think about bracing, and then you can start thinking about hinging at the hip and movement. So this then leads me on to the final part, is what is a more sensible approach to rehabilitating a lower back with everyday life and movement involved. And there are 4 basic points to this. Is 1, don't be too rigid. 2, don't be too sloppy. 3, be appropriate. And 4, we've got to think about what has been described as a low back pain account, if you will. So let's start number 1. Don't be too rigid. If you are too rigid with the spine, you will be too robotic, and that can cause its own problems. So where I've talked about being in a proper position, maintaining an elastic equilibrium, hinging at the hip, there needs to be, we can't be too rigid, we can't be too robotic. Now, if you are in the midst of a lower back pain episode and you know you have intolerances with flexion and extension or rotation or lateral flexion to the spine, then that is the time to be most rigid. So there is a time to be more rigid and there is a time to not be too rigid. But what we have to think about is we can't be rigid 100% of the time. When the pain starts to dampen, we can start coming out of that rigidness. Now that's not to mean that we then need to go in flowing types of movement, because that brings me on to part number 2, which is don't be too sloppy. Because if we're sloppy with our movement, that's going to take us back to that episode of pain that we had, where we have to then become rigid. So we go between these rigid and sloppy movements, if you will. And then you've got professionals and people and influencers who probably aren't professionals, that don't understand these things, that are telling you to move your spine. But that could be creating sloppiness, which then sends you back. So what we need to be able to do is be appropriate, which is point number 3. There is a time to be rigid, and there is a time, well, there isn't really a time to be sloppy, but you can be sloppy if you've built up a low back pain account, and I'll come on to that in a second. But when we talk about being appropriate, it's move the spine at an appropriate time. So if you need to lift something off the floor and you know you can't get down there with a neutral spine, you're going to have to use a flex spine. But don't be sloppy with that. Brace the abdominals to stabilize the vertebra in that flex posture. So there are caveats to these types of things that we need to understand. Now, the final point is the low back pain account. So when we're in the midst of a low back pain episode, let's just say this is the baseline for where back pain happens. So when you are below the baseline, you're in pain. Now, you need to be rigid there to start bringing that sort of your back pain account up above, so you're in credit, if you will. But you're still really close. So if you do something wrong, you could just drop straight back under and be in pain again. But once we get to here, we need to start building this up. Now, this build up, so the gap between this finger and this finger is known as a margin of error. Now, if we're here, we've got a very small margin of error. If we do one thing wrong, we drop back into pain. If we can build ourselves up and build up this margin of error, when we do one thing wrong, we just drop down to here and then we build back up again, so we don't go into pain. If we are too sloppy for too long, we'll just chink away at our low back pain account, and eventually one movement, plop, and we'll be back in pain. So that's if we're too sloppy. If we go too rigid, we may get to here, but we won't get any further, and then we drop back in because we're too scared to get out of the rigidness, if you will. And we need to start rebuilding our movement. So we need to start thinking we can't be too rigid, but there is a time and a place for it. We can't be too sloppy, but there isn't a time and a place for it. We need to be appropriate and be rigid where we need to be rigid, be sloppy where we need to be sloppy, but we need to maintain some proper guiding principles of movement. What this is then doing, this is building up our low back pain account and building up our margin of error, so that when we do become sloppy and we don't have good posture and good movement and we load the spine too much, we don't come all the way back down to being in pain. We just drop our way back down here and we build ourselves back up. An example of that might be you're coming out of lower back pain, you've built up your movement, but you know you get pain from sitting too long, and you've got a big car journey coming up. You're going to have to get in the car, you're going to have to sit down. So if you can build that margin of error up, that when you sit in the car, it only drops to here and you don't get the pain, you can then get back out and you're up here. Or you start to experience the pain, but when you get out, you can build it back up using guiding principles of movement. So again, I could go on about different examples, but that's the idea of movement and lower back pain. There's a time and a place. There's a time to be rigid, there's a time to be sloppy. But it's more important to be appropriate and use these things more consciously rather than just going into exercise, using flexion extension cycles, which could be the very problem that's driving your pain. And we need to think about it in a slightly different way and use more guiding principles of things like elastic equilibrium or neutral spine, bracing the abdominals, moving from the hips and the shoulders, and lifting and, well, moving in general more appropriately, building up the core stability, building up the core endurance, and building up the core strength as well. So there's all these different pieces that go into the mix. But what we've got to understand first is what type of back pain you have and your triggers. If we can understand those, we can then start putting all the movement pieces together to get you out of the pain. So that brings me to the end, because again, I could go around in circles with examples of that and repeat myself, and I'm not going to do that. So many thanks for watching. My name is Chris. Hopefully this has been helpful. If you've enjoyed the content, hit the like button. If you've learned something new, hit the thanks button. If you've got a comment or a question, leave it in the comment section below. If you want to hear more tutorials like this, please do hit the subscribe button and the bell icon.